Hello and welcome back. This is the week 13 lecture. So we are nearing the end. You guys, we only have two films left. Obviously, this week we're talking about Good Will Hunting, and then next week we conclude with Shakespeare in Love. So this film is another example of a popular film, a film that sort of transcended its early independent roots, although this was not an extremely low budget production, as we can probably tell. But it was an indie, picked up by Miramax, found a very wide audience, found a lot of sort of mainstream success. And we've been talking about this in reference to a lot of the films that we've been watching recently, Hoop Dreams, Pulp Fiction, Clerks, going back to Dazed and Confused. I've been talking a lot about how these films kind of, became more popular in certain ways, more popular than perhaps what was expected, more popular, more financially successful than independent films had traditionally been. We mentioned Pulp Fiction becoming the first indie to make over $100 million, if we consider it to be an indie. That is still kind of debatable, since by the time it comes out, Miramax had been purchased by Disney. But one term that I've used a lot when talking about some of these other films is cult film or cult movie. I've talked about these movies achieving a sort of cult status. I think I at least used that term in reference to Clerks, and I probably used it several weeks ago when we were talking about Dazed and Confused. I wouldn't necessarily use that term this week for Good Will Hunting, though. I mean, this film just became popular. It became a mainstream success with really no qualifiers. I would argue that this film perhaps found a more broad viewership than a traditional cult movie, because when we talk about cult movies, at least typically, part of what we mean is that the movie maybe did not find a ton of success immediately upon its release. So maybe the film didn't make a lot of money in theaters. We talked about that with Dazed and Confused and Clerks. They really found more success later on home video. A lot of people rented these movies, watched them on VHS or DVD. So we talked about that a little bit, and we also talked about how those films kind of tapped in to very specific markets, or they sort of appealed to very specific types of audiences. And that's kind of interesting to consider. With Dazed and Confused, we sort of talked about how the movie was popular with young people, generally speaking, high schoolers, college-age people, and as a lot of you pointed out on the discussion board, the film was also popular with people who were like in their late 30s or maybe their 40s by the 90s, but they could remember growing up in the 70s. When the film was set. They could remember, being in high school or college during that time, so the film was very nostalgic for them. But again, those are very specific types of audience members, people who belong to a certain generation or a certain age group. So that's often how we talk about that movie. We would often describe that movie as a cult favorite, a cult film. Clerks is kind of similar. Even a movie like Pulp Fiction, which was obviously very successful financially, I would argue that it primarily appeals to people who like gangster movies, people who like crime movies, and as a lot of you pointed out on the discussion board, that's not necessarily our genre of choice. That's not a lot of people's genre of choice. So if you don't like gangster movies and you haven't watched many of them, Tarantino's style might be a little bit alienating, or as some of you said, maybe just a little bit boring, because that's just not your preferred milieu, that's not your preferred style. Now, of course, we know Tarantino has made other kinds of movies, but he does have a distinctive style, and not everybody likes it. It's a bit of an acquired taste. Not everybody is going to dig his style, regardless of the genre that he's working within. So again, I find Good Will Hunting to be a different sort of movie. It's a different animal. I think it can appeal to virtually any viewer. Of course, not everybody's going to like it. I'm assuming that some of us will not like it, but just the way it's made, the kind of emotional register that it operates in, the writing, some of the performances, which might be what made the film truly what it would become. These powerhouse performances from Robin Williams, who won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. A lot of people think Matt Damon's portrayal of Will is very powerful. People like Ben Affleck in the supporting role of Chucky. So maybe it's the performances, maybe it's the writing. We can talk more about Damon and Affleck. Because they co-wrote the screenplay, they worked together on the screenplay. But that stuff, those elements really appealed to a lot of viewers. There's a sort of classic, traditional style on display in this movie. I'll try to explain that over the course of our lecture here, but I think it's different from a lot of the other movies that we've watched. We've seen a lot of offbeat, strange cinematic visions. We've also just seen stuff that's different from the mainstream, different from what we would often associate with mainstream Hollywood filmmaking. Just, different kinds of plots, different kinds of characters, different kinds of settings. One thing we haven't really discussed very much, but I think it's just kind of common knowledge, the way a lot of people think about independent film, the way a lot of people sort of describe art house cinema or independent cinema, one word that you often hear is difficult. These films can sometimes be difficult. And that can mean a lot of different things, but I think what it often means is because they're unconventional, because they're a little bit offbeat, they don't have a lot of the features that we're used to finding in more conventional movie making, right? The plot might be slower. There might not be a lot of action. There might not be the kinds of relationships we're accustomed to seeing. It might be in black and white. There might be certain limitations brought on by budget constraints, right? We've noticed that. Limited locations, kind of shoddy set design, or, amateur actors. We've mentioned that in a few different films. And all of those factors can sometimes contribute to what some viewers or even critics or scholars might sometimes call sort of an added level of difficulty. The films might, these kind of indie arty films might not be quite as accessible to a broad audience. And of course, that's what movie executives thought for a long time. Even in the 80s, as we see a lot of studios developing these separate arms or branches that could specialize in independent movies, it was still kind of kept separate, from the big business of mainstream blockbusters. The executives saw that there was some money in independent cinema, but it was always assumed there was just a lot less money, and it was sometimes more about getting critical acclaim. The sort of stereotype about a lot of these movies is, they might not make a lot of money, but they're often critical darlings because they're maybe innovative or interesting in terms of technique and style and their influences. So you might get some good write-ups in film journals or magazines from critics and scholars who like the movie, but a lot of people might not pay money to see the movie. So that was long sort of the conventional wisdom, but of course over the course of the 90s that's changing. We see the success of Pulp Fiction, we see the success of other films like Dazed and Confused and Clerks, which again get famous a little bit later after they first come out, but they still end up becoming cult films that have big impacts on the culture. And now we arrive in 1997 with Good Will Hunting. And I would argue that with this film, we don't have to call it a cult classic. It doesn't reach a really niche, specialized audience only. It's kind of a movie for everybody. And we can observe that on a lot of different levels. Again, there are certain structural things about this movie that are very much steeped in just sort of traditional, classic Hollywood filmmaking. Like I said, But then there's also some interesting stuff going on with like social class. I think there's some interesting commentary that appealed to a lot of viewers for some reasons that we can explore as well. So there's lots of things that made this movie sort of a crowd pleaser. And I want to explore a lot of that this week. Also important to point out that this is the second film we're watching from the director Gus Van Sant. So of course he brought us My Own Private Idaho, which we watched, when was that? Week 7 maybe? So it's been a while, but we remember that film. We remember that there were a lot of unconventional, offbeat characteristics of that film. I mean, it really was an interesting shift that we could sort of observe. It starts out kind of one way, and then we end up in sort of pastoral Italy. The tone shifts. There were a lot of kind of eccentric moments, kind of offbeat little touches that Van Sant included. A lot of us noticed some of that. So My Own Private Idaho is a very different kind of film, from what we see here. A lot of those kinds of flourishes, those kinds of almost surrealistic moments that we saw in My Own Private Idaho, some gestures back to Van Sant's previous career as a photographer, a visual style that was kind of noticeable at times, very well done, but we noticed how it shifted from kind of a gritty portrait of street hustlers with a lot of Shakespeare thrown in, and then later we have a love story in rural Italy. Like, it really shifts gears. A lot of tonal shifts, a lot of shifts in style, visual style included. So we noticed that, and now we're seeing that Van Sant is, kind of doing something different, I would argue. I don't think his visual style is as distinctive in this film. It's still a very well put together movie, but it's kind of a far less showy, a far less sort of intrusive style. We might think of it like that, just sort of, he's kind of getting out of the way. It's a visual style that just feels kind of normal and typical for a big, Hollywood movie. We get some on-location shooting. So we're in Boston for a lot of the exteriors. I think his main purpose here, if I could speculate a little bit with Van Sant, I think he's just really trying to capture realism, which he does at times in My Own Private Idaho as well. But he likes to do a lot of different things in that more arty film from earlier in the decade. Here, it just seems like more of a straightforward narrative style where they're really trying to create a strong sense of place. Not just Boston, right, but South Boston, a particular part of the city, a particular neighborhood which seems kind of run down, kind of economically disadvantaged, and that's of course where Will and his friends live. And then we get this really strong, noticeable contrast between their milieu, their kind of working class, lower class kind of background versus the hallowed halls of academia. Because that's an interesting thing about our setting. And I think Van Sant and the writers here, Damon and Affleck, very much want us to know that in Boston, we have a lot of elite institutions of higher education. You guys probably know that already. Boston is the home of Harvard. It's the home of MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's where Will works as a janitor in the film. That's where Dr. Lambeau works, is MIT. But there's a ton of colleges in Boston. There's a ton. Those are some of the more famous ones, but there's also Boston College, Boston University, Northeastern, bunch of smaller schools, and there's community colleges, just like there are anywhere. And of course, Sean McGuire, the character played by Robin Williams, he works at Bunker Hill Community College. And that's a very different academic setting, of course, compared to Harvard or MIT. And Sean is more of a sort of working class representative, a working class kid sort of made good, almost like a model for Will to a certain extent. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here with social class and these certain divides that we can find within a relatively small space. Like Harvard and MIT geographically are not far at all from where Will lives. But in terms of like social stuff, they might as well be on a different planet. But of course, the story we're getting here is of a sort of hard luck, low income kid who has a great gift. And the question is, will he be able to use his gift to get out of his crappy neighborhood, to transcend his humble origins and make something of himself? This is a classic American story. You guys don't need me to tell you that. This story gets told a lot in American literature, American films, TV, and in a lot of ways, we saw a very similar narrative play out last week, didn't we? With William and Arthur trying to get out of inner city Chicago using their athletic gifts, using their ability to play basketball to maybe get them into college, maybe get them into a career. So it's similar here. It's just that Will isn't using sports. He's using his mathematical genius to potentially transcend his very humble circumstances. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about social class today because, I don't know, I think in America we don't really talk about class a whole lot. Sometimes we do, but there's an old joke that I think has a lot of truth to it. It says that, I think it was probably coined by a non-American, but this idea that in America, everybody thinks that they're middle class, whether they actually are or not. So the joke is you can ask a rich person, they'll say they're middle class. You can ask a poor person, they'll say the same thing. I don't know if that's so true today because I think a lot of people are kind of aware that the American middle class, it's not exactly booming and growing. In some ways, it's kind of shrinking. And a lot of people do think that there's a troubling level of income inequality in America. We don't need to get into all of that. I'm not an expert. I can't teach you about that. But some of that stuff is kind of, right beneath the surface, or in some cases kind of explicit, I think, in the film. Class difference, it doesn't always get directly commented on, but there's a lot of sort of visual indications. We get a lot of what some critics would refer to as like working class signifiers in this film. A lot of visual cues or even things that are put into the screenplay that sort of remind us that Will and Chucky, and their friends, Billy, Morgan, that whole little crew, like they occupy a very different position on the social, in a sort of larger social hierarchy compared to someone like Dr. Lambo, who works at MIT. He's a world-renowned mathematician, and of course he wants Will to, work with him and use his ability to become very successful in his own right, as Lambo has. And we're often, I think, in the film, but I want to hear what you guys say too, but I would argue that we're often sort of, as viewers, we're sort of encouraged to identify more with the working class characters in the film. Not just Will and his buddies, but also Sean, right? We're supposed to identify Sean as coming from the same place, the same kind of place. Maybe he's from South Boston too. I don't quite remember. I think he is. Isn't his dad his dad was like a bricklayer or something? Like he has working class roots. Much like Will. So they're able to kind of bond for more reasons than just that. But again, we're supposed to kind of recognize that Sean, even though he's an academic too, right? He works at a college, makes pretty good money, but he's different than Lambo, right? They're different. They have different worldviews. They sort of occupy different class positions, but I think most importantly, they have sort of different definitions of success and what really constitutes success, and that gets sort of played out in the movie in some interesting ways that we can observe. But like I said, I think in America we have kind of a weird relationship with social class because a lot of Americans, and I would include myself because my parents would always tell me this too, that class doesn't really matter in America. It's not supposed to, right? I mean, that's very much part of our mythology. It's very much part of, some of the values and beliefs that we really hold in this country is the idea that it doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter if you were born into a wealthy family. If you work hard, if you do the right things, and of course, if you're gifted, like somebody like Will, you can go far. But of course, we got to remember that a lot of older societies, class kind of plays a bigger role, or at least it gets talked about sort of more openly. I'm just thinking about the difference between US movies and movies from the UK. Like thinking about the Brits, they talk about class often a lot more explicitly than Americans do. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, they're a much older society. They have a much more well-established kind of social hierarchy. Of course, they still have a monarchy, although it's kind of just a figurehead now, but they still have an aristocracy, they still have nobility, so there's a distinction, there's a lot of distinctions within social class, and they have really sort of coherent, I'm no expert, but I'm basing this mostly on just watching movies, but they have more of a sort of coherent kind of like class identity. Like if you are working class, in England, like that's kind of a part of your identity. At least I think it's traditionally been that way. And if you're lower middle class or middle class, that's kind of different than maybe upper middle or upper class. And they all have different kinds of worldviews, different values, different cultural tastes. Some of that's also, you can find some of that at work in America, but again, we're supposed to be more of a classless society. At least that's kind of the idea. So, I don't think we're as eager to align ourselves with a larger sort of class consciousness. I mean, again, there's always exceptions. Plenty of people do that. But I just think on average, fewer Americans do that than what you might find in, sort of our peer nations, like in Western Europe and other parts of the world. So I think it's always sort of a delicate thing when we talk about class in American literature or American film, because it's often, there's a lot of kind of contradictory messages sometimes that viewers get bombarded with, because on one hand, we always, again, I don't want to say always, everybody's different, but a lot of viewers tend to kind of identify with or sympathize with sort of blue-collar, working-class characters. And we're often sort of encouraged to not like really elite, powerful, maybe wealthy characters. They can often be villainous or, maybe just, harmful in some way. But we also have a certain affinity for material success. And I don't mean that like as a criticism. I just think it's kind of a fact in America. And I think it's natural to a certain extent. Like we sort of value professions that make a lot of money, medical doctors, high-powered lawyers. Well, I guess not everybody likes lawyers, but, a lot of our most prestigious job occupations, confer a lot of money. They earn a lot of money for the people who do them. And we often think about financial success as just kind of objectively good, especially, again, with people like Will or William or Arthur, gifted people who have a talent that might be marketable. Like, we generally view that as a really good thing. Yeah, get rich off of that. That's great. So I think there's sometimes a little bit of a tension between the kinds of characters that we root for and maybe the kinds of lifestyles that in some cases we might want or value or think, are good. And that's kind of a tension that Will experiences in the film, right? He has a lot of people, namely Lambo, but even Chucky too, telling him, hey, get out of here. Like, get out of South Boston. Go and make money. Use your mathematical brilliance, to make money and get a good job and have a good life. But he also has some reluctance, to leave what he knows and to leave a certain kind of working class atmosphere that he very much identifies with and feels at home in. But of course, Will's a very complicated character, right? He's a genius. He's this sort of self-taught, incredibly smart guy, but he's also an orphan. He's come up through foster care. He's been abused. He's obviously working through a lot of trauma. He has a lot of anger issues, as we know. So this is a character that a lot of people found very affecting. An easy character to root for. We might get mad at him at times, especially early in the film when he's kind of mean and, kind of difficult to work with. And then we see his process of growth. He falls in love with Skylar and his life changes a lot. But remember, again, Sean's kind of there as kind of this model of like what like all the good things that a certain sort of blue-collar working class masculinity can be. I'd argue Lambo represents something else. Lambo represents kind of elitism. He represents kind of maybe some of the less pleasing qualities of elite institutions like Harvard and MIT. Although I wouldn't say he's totally a villain, but Sean definitely stands out as kind of just more like morally upright, more sympathetic in a lot of ways, and it seems that Will can perhaps learn from him, emulate him in some ways. But my final thought just on this kind of general topic about class, I just want to add another concept that I think is important when we're analyzing this film. You may have heard this before. It's been used by scholars and critics in a lot of different fields, but it's been used specifically to talk about a lot of American movies. It's a character type that we see on display in this film. It's often referred to as the white ethnic character type. White ethnic characters being essentially what we see here with these Irish Americans, growing up, living in South Boston. So there's a long lineage of white ethnic characters, particularly if you're thinking about gangster movies and crime films. So I don't want to delve too deeply into this, but just be aware that this lineage exists, And I've talked about it a little bit in the past. If you remember when we were discussing Do the Right Thing, I mentioned Danny Aiello, who plays Sal, a kind of famous Italian-American actor. And I think I made the joke, I've made it at some point, that generally, actors like him would play either gangsters or cops, or like a hitman, like those were generally the kinds of roles you would see him in. And that's true. And that was true in older decades. That was true for a lot of Italian Americans and Irish Americans. They were sometimes still kind of thought as being somewhat different. That's really what the white ethnic designation is all about. Like, these are white people, obviously. These are white people of European descent. Okay? So we know that, but they're kind of othered from other white people. Right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. So part of it, at least if you go back far enough, this is kind of based in history. Like, there were a lot of Irish immigrants, a lot of Italian immigrants, really starting from the late 1800s all the way through the first half of the 20th century. And a lot of them, of course, settled in northeastern cities like New York, like Boston. And at least initially, when they first came over, a lot of them were discriminated against. Because they were different from the white people who were already here. They were often Catholic. That was true of Irish and Italian immigrants in particular. A lot of Polish immigrants would have been Catholic. Others from Southern or Eastern Europe were in some cases Catholic, or in other cases Jewish. So, of course, that also othered them and opened them up to discrimination. But if we're thinking more about, like, these guys' ancestors, the Irish Americans who came over to places like Boston, really as early as the potato famine in the 19th century, and then continuing for, a good while after that, when they were sort of viewed as lesser than when they first came over. They assimilated. I would argue that anti-Irish sort of stuff really only, scholars have shown that probably only lasted for a few generations. But again, they were often thought of as a little bit different than your typical Anglo-Saxon, Protestant American. They tended to live in urban spaces, They tended to live in the kinds of milieus, the kinds of settings that we see here, kind of, packed in, close quarters, urban life. And if you go back to a lot of older gangster movies, a lot of those gangsters were Italian or Irish or Jewish, as I've mentioned before. So there's just a long tradition of this. And, they're often kind of thought of as somewhat criminal, somewhat marginalized, kind of separate from mainstream society. So you guys have probably experienced some of this with Italian-American gangsters. Even if you don't like the genre, you're probably familiar with Goodfellas or The Godfather. But this tradition goes all the way back to like the 20s, the 30s. And Martin Scorsese is a director who makes a lot of use of the white ethnic character type. Because again, most of his movies center around, not all, he doesn't just make gangster movies, but a lot of them do center around Italians, or in the case of The Departed, which is I think the film he finally won an Oscar for, a Best Picture Oscar. He or is it either Best Picture or Best Director? But in that one, they're Irish, in Boston. So again, there's a long tradition. If you know James Cagney, an old actor from like the 30s and 40s, he played a lot of Irish gangsters in really old gangster movies. He was the original Scarface, in fact. So there's a long tradition that, we just sort of need to be aware of. And again, these characters often show up in gangster movies, crime movies, or just movies set in urban spaces like this one. They're proud Irish Americans, but it's interesting to kind of compare them to some of the other characters that we've seen recently. Again, thinking about William and Arthur last week, a lot of similarities. William and Arthur, obviously African Americans in inner city Chicago. But these characters in South Boston are sort of experiencing some of the same things. Lack of economic opportunity, kind of a rundown, crime-infested neighborhood. They have some, issues with the criminal justice system. Again, in a lot of ways, Will is actually a delinquent. I mean, Will has committed crimes. Like, Will is very defiant. He's a troublemaker. And that's not true of William and Arthur. They're trying to get away from that stuff. Will almost seems to be perhaps contributing a little bit to the danger associated with his neighborhood. So, but again, they're in these sort of rundown, dystopian urban spaces, and the journey, the challenge sort of placed before these characters is, can you get out? Can you rise above? And that's what we're watching to see if Will do. So again, we have this gritty urban setting. We see that in the early scenes, but we also see that juxtaposition that I was talking about earlier when we look at, where Will lives, and then we see MIT, the immaculate hallways, this venue for learning and success. And of course, Will is a janitor there. So we immediately see that part of this world that we're in, Boston, this particular setting at this particular time, part of what we're meant to understand is, there's a lot of different social classes, there's a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different kinds of social status on display in this relatively, small geographical space. And it seems like they want to do some stuff with that, and they want to make us think a little bit about some of these class-based differences, or some of these, cultural differences. And that's really where a lot of the drama, a lot of the tension of the film comes from, right? Will starts to move in a world that's very different, from the world that he's used to. Even going to therapy is obviously quite a leap for him. That's kind of a challenge. But also his relationship with Skylar, his interactions with Lambo and other people, who want him to go on to be this successful mathematician. It's very different, from his world. So we're constantly reminded of that. There's that famous scene, of course, where they go to the Harvard bar. The guys go to the Harvard bar. That's where we have our little meet cute between Will and Skylar. But that's also the famous "You Like Apples" scene, where he sort of wins the girl and humiliates the pretentious, preppy kid from Harvard. And again, I think the way that scene is written, the way it's shot, the way it's acted, we're supposed to kind of revel in Will's victory. Will shows his knowledge. He actually shows that he knows more than the arrogant Harvard guy. So it's like a victory for Will and his friends. It's a victory for the working class to a certain extent. But of course, the question is, can Will stay with his friends? Can he stay within his class identity once his gifts are discovered? Right? So that's an interesting tension to look at. Is it possible to maintain the kind of identity that he has while also, utilizing his his genius? Can he do both, or is it really a choice between the two? South Boston and his buddies, or, whatever that future vision of success might be. So that's a big source of tension throughout the film. So, by the time we go to the Harvard bar, we've already seen the bar in Southie where these guys normally go, the L Street Tavern. So we have an earlier scene in there. Very different atmosphere, right? So again, we're constantly reminded of these differences. These differences between Will and his friends and this sort of world of academia, this bigger world where people like Lambeau and Schuyler sort of exist. I think we need to form some opinions about some of these differences that are on display. Is there anything sort of wrong with it? Like, do we feel like there's real social commentary here? Meaning sort of like, maybe a social critique, like we think something's wrong with these disparities? Or is it just sort of the way things are, just kind of a natural order of things? So we get a lot of reminders of the social and class divides that exist in places like Boston. And again, I'm always interested in how the audience is encouraged to respond, or who or what the audience is encouraged to identify with. So there's a great scene that I like to point people to around like the 23-minute mark. You might remember it is when Lambeau is trying to find out more information about Will. Like by this point, Will has already solved that theorem or whatever, the proof that has been stumping all of the MIT students. So Lambeau wants to find this guy. He wants to sit down and talk to him. So he goes to the building and grounds office to talk to those guys because, that's the department that employs Will. And he's accompanied by his little toady, like his assistant guy. I can't remember his name. But the guy's sort of introducing Lambeau. And he's like, this is Dr. Lambeau. Like, don't you know who this guy is? Talking to the maintenance guys who, of course, don't care. Like, they don't care who Lambeau is. They're not interested, really, in helping him or having any real interaction with him. And when they try to introduce Lambeau, the maintenance guys are like, oh, yeah, well, this is Professor Hayes. So it's a joke, and I think we're encouraged to laugh at Lambeau, right? As viewers, we're encouraged to sort of, side with the maintenance guys and to kind of laugh at these pretentious academics who think the world revolves around them and think that just because Lambeau's written some articles about math and he goes to conferences that these maintenance guys, these working class guys who are probably natives of Boston, whereas a lot of academics, move around, they're probably locals, they're working class guys, they don't care. Right? And they make a joke, a pretty good one, at Lambeau's expense, and we're encouraged to laugh at it. And again, Lambeau doesn't come off as a super sympathetic character, I don't think. But I like the performance by Stellan Skarsgård, and also just the way that character's written. Like, he's not a cartoonish villain. He is kind of an arrogant, pretentious academic. I mean, it's not a shocker. A big-time guy that teaches at MIT probably really would be that way. And we see him kind of hit on his students a lot. Again, kind of a subtle marker that shows us that he's different from Sean, right? Sean's just a better dude by almost any objective measure. But we later see that Lambeau's not really like trying to hurt Will. I mean, he doesn't really have any like bad intentions necessarily. He just has a very different worldview compared to Sean, certainly, and even compared to Will, we think. I mean, he just has a different way of defining success. For him, you have to work at the best school, you have to get the job at the best company, you have to make the most money possible, you have to make a sort of name for yourself, and then we see how Sean defines success much differently, right? For Sean, it's more, I guess, about like family and being true to your roots to a certain extent. It's more about relationships. So that's an important dichotomy that I think we're supposed to notice. And that scene, again, it encourages us to laugh at Lambeau, but we then have to ask ourselves, like, do we necessarily disagree with Lambeau when it comes to what Will should do? We might agree that he's kind of pretentious and obnoxious, but do we think he's wrong? do we think he's wrong for encouraging Will to go and make a lot of money and be successful? Again, typically we think those are good things. But when it clashes with a certain sense of like community or identity or some notion of being true to oneself, it becomes an interesting conflict that we have to sort of, reconcile, sort out. But again, I just find that it's often an almost instinctive move for audiences to sympathize or identify more with blue-collar, working-class characters as opposed to characters like Lambo. So again, Will, despite being troubled, he does have a lot of personal traits that we value. Again, sort of tapping into a lot of just sort of American values and beliefs, right? He's independent, he's sort of a self-made man. Like I said, he's an autodidact, which means he's self-taught. He's a genius, but he kind of keeps that secret because he doesn't want to be any different. He doesn't want to be perceived any differently from, his friends and peers and the other guys from the neighborhood. Right? So that includes Chucky, who's of course played by Ben Affleck, but also Billy, who you should recognize. He's played by Cole Hauser, who also appeared in Dazed and Confused. He was one of the football players. And then you might recognize Casey Affleck, who plays Morgan, of course, Ben's real-life younger brother, who's gone on to become a pretty successful actor in his own right. So, Will doesn't want to be any different from the other guys. He's very loyal, right? That's a trait that we often value in our society. And again, he's just, he's hardworking, but he's not pretentious. He doesn't think that his brilliance makes him better than other people. And we get the sense that with a character like Lambo, he does kind of think that his intelligence, his accomplishments make him a little bit better, and that's off-putting oftentimes, but Will doesn't seem to be like that. So again, we prize a lot of those traits, but also I think in this country it's a long tradition again in our art of really liking this idea of the diamond in the rough, right? This really gifted, talented person who comes from a really humble origin. Right? Finding great talent, great ability in a place where you might not expect to find it. That's, again, a very old trope in American fiction, film, everything. So Will definitely represents that. But maybe Sean too, because again, Sean's from that same general area. Sean's a Bostonian. He's Irish American, right? He has a lot of the same traits that Will has. So I want you guys to notice that, right? A sense of humor, he's like physically strong and he's tough, right? When Will crosses the line before they really become friendly, when Will's still kind of pushing him and challenging him, Sean gets in his face, like Sean's ready to physically fight, right? So again, we're supposed to notice that. Like Sean, at heart, is another guy from the neighborhood, another Irish kid who grew up a little bit like Will, has a lot in common, but he's done well for himself. He went to school. He's a former classmate of Lambo, so he was obviously a good student, successful, but he's working at a community college helping kids like Will, whereas Lambo is at an elite institution helping, not all kids that go to MIT are wealthy, but, a lot of them are quite a bit different from Will. So again, that all matters, right? Bunker Hill Community College versus MIT. Sean versus Lambo. And again, while we see Lambo hitting on his students and being just a little bit oily, meanwhile, Sean has this deep reservoir of love and affection for his deceased wife. He might even border on the sentimental, but we like that because he's sentimental about his wife. That's a good thing to be sentimental about, right? And he values relationships. He's caring. He's sensitive, but he's also kind of tough because of those blue-collar roots. He loves the Red Sox, just like Will does. So, again, a better model, perhaps, of masculinity compared to Lambo, as those two kind of battle it out to try to determine what Will's future should be. So again, kind of the elite versus the working class, and two different definitions of success. What really does constitute a successful life? So yeah, like I mentioned, just a lot of working class signifiers. There's another scene kind of late in the film that just always stands out to me. It's Billy, who's not really a major character, but again, we don't need to know much about him. He's one of the guys. But there's this scene where he bursts into the L Street Tavern, right, their bar, and he's like wearing his mechanic outfit. So we don't need a lot of dialogue about that. We don't need Billy's whole backstory, but he barges in there like with a cigarette and he's like drinking a beer, but he has to get back. He's got, he's got, grease all over him. He's an auto mechanic. That's another sort of recognizable, like working class kind of blue collar job. We see Chucky and Will working construction. So we get reminded constantly of kind of where they are, how they're positioned in this larger sort of social framework. But again, it's interesting to think about Chucky a little bit, a character that a lot of people like. The one scene or sequence that I found from this movie that kind of put me in mind of My Own Private Idaho and Van Sant's style in that one was when Chucky impersonates Will and goes on those job interviews, and it's just kind of silly and comic, like some of those interludes that we had in My Own Private Idaho. But anyway, Chucky ultimately has a message for Will that's quite similar to what Lambo thinks, right? But it's delivered, of course, in a more sort of heartfelt, likable way. That is kind of a famous scene when Chucky's like, every morning, when I go to pick you up, I hope you're not there. I hope you finally decided to take off and you don't even say goodbye to anybody, the old Irish goodbye. You just take off and you go and make something of yourself. So again, it's interesting to think that that's essentially what Lambo's saying, but of course Chucky's his closest friend. Chucky really cares about him. But again, it's this idea that to be successful, to really be successful, to fully realize your unique gifts, you might have to leave South Boston, and just go and live somewhere else and do something totally different. So it's interesting to note that despite all of these working class trappings, all of this sort of sympathy that's engendered for working class, blue collar characters, the film, to me, and you guys might disagree, I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well, but to me, the film seems to at least sort of implicitly endorse, economic, upward mobility, using your gifts to improve your life in sort of a lot of different ways, right? Having more healthy habits, stop beating people up and going to jail, but also, make more money and live a more sort of comfortable existence. So again, I would identify that as sort of a common contradiction in a lot of American narratives. We value working class people, but we often place a high value on economic success, and making it for us in many cases just means, making a lot of money, or at least making enough money to where your life is just sort of demonstrably better, more comfortable than the life we see Will and Chucky and them living. So it's always just a very interesting, delicate balance, because on one hand, again, these characters seem kind of cool and tough, and a lot of people just liked them. I don't know if you guys will, but a lot of people just like Will and Chucky. But at the same time, it's like they don't really have much. They don't have a lot. They've been left behind to a certain extent. So, we kind of have to reconcile those two things. We like them. They seem to be sort of comfortable in their position. They have a certain pride of place. They're loyal to one another. They seem authentic, right? That's the language we often use for characters like that. Salt of the earth, authentic, hardworking, right? But they often don't have much. They often don't have much money. They often don't have a lot of access to education, at least not the kind of education that Skylar's getting, not the kind of education that we see at MIT or Harvard, right? So, yeah, I want you guys to maybe share your own thoughts about all of that. And as the film progresses, so we get a lot of this stuff, a lot of this kind of social commentary, I would argue, kind of early in the film, right? Part of the setup. We're understanding these differences in class and culture, and we're understanding the many obstacles that Will has to overcome. But then, so we get a lot of that early in the movie, and then I would argue the film really starts to center around the two most important relationships in Will's life. The first one being with Sean, his therapist, and the other one, of course, his romantic relationship with Skylar, played by Minnie Driver. So I don't know what you guys think about that love story. Like, do you find it pretty predictable and conventional, or do you think it's a big part of the film, especially in the second half? It obviously drives a lot of the plot. But what do we think about maybe the chemistry between the two actors, or like what do we think about that relationship just in general, the way it's portrayed? Of course, that's part of what Will's trying to accept, right? He hasn't really had a lot of, I guess, meaningful, long-standing romantic relationships. He's kind of afraid of the commitment, the vulnerability, and we have a lot of reasons for that. But how does that play out? Is it affecting? Is it powerful? A lot of people think the movie might have done the male relationships a little bit better, like maybe captured the male friendships a little bit better. But I would be interested to hear what you guys think. But like I was saying earlier, again, Affleck and Damon, who wrote the screenplay and won an Oscar. Let me mention that before I forget. I said earlier that Robin Williams won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, and then Affleck and Damon shared the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. So this is interesting to note there. But I think it's something that they put into the screenplay very much, and then Van Sant is able to tap into it as well. But just what a lot of critics refer to as sort of the conventional beats and emotional registers of like classic Hollywood filmmaking, right? A lot of things that, we probably don't notice because they're just very typical things to find in sort of crowd-pleasing, emotionally uplifting movies, which is ultimately what this kind of becomes, or what it's supposed to become, right? So a lot of touchstones that we're going to see in a lot of other Hollywood films, right? A lot of powerful speeches given by characters, right? I've mentioned some of those, Chucky and Sean in particular. The whole I have to go see about a girl thing, right? How Sean first kind of brings that up and then Will repeats it, right? That sort of sentimental, romantic trope. It shows up a lot. There's some swelling orchestral music, right? At certain times, there's a lot of just sort of emotional beats that are designed to, I think, make us feel, make us care about these characters. But it's all just sort of very stately, somewhat traditional, somewhat classic in its execution. And I don't mean any of that as an insult. But the visual style here, it might not strike us as especially distinctive or innovative, and not as eccentric or offbeat as what we saw from Van Sant back in My Own Private Idaho. Again, it seems like Van Sant is more just sort of staying out of the way. This time, he just wants to capture this place. We get pretty conventional, solid camera work, nothing super dynamic or out of the ordinary, but it's also not calling attention to itself by being super static or weird, right? It's just kind of normal, natural. Instead of thinking a whole lot about cinematography here, we might think a little bit more about set design and really just mise-en-scene in general. Remember, mise-en-scene's kind of like everything else that appears on screen that's sort of separate from camera work or maybe lighting. Everything else. So obviously that includes sets, especially if we're inside, set design. And then if we're outside, what do those exteriors look like? But remember, mise-en-scene can also include stuff like costumes, actors' hair, their clothes, makeup. All of that stuff factors in. It's all stuff that we can see on the screen, but it's not directly tied to camera work. It's not directly tied to cinematography, right? So I always think about set design here. What do the interiors look like? and how do they help to create these very distinctive different kinds of sense of place, right? So we have academia, right? We spend some time in school. We spend a lot of other time in South Boston, right? We spend time in the neighborhood. We spend time in some of their homes, but then we're at Harvard or we're at MIT. We spend time in Sean's office at Bunker Hill, right? So what does that look like? You got the Irish flag, you got a Red Sox pennant, right? These matter. These are visual cues that mean a lot for the character, and they're meant to be picked up on, by us. One interesting thing to note here is that most of the exterior shooting, like I think I've already said this, most of the exterior shots were done in Boston. So we are getting a pretty authentic look at certain parts of the city. But then most of our interior scenes that take place in the schools, a lot of that was done at the University of Toronto. But a lot of those exterior shots are in Boston. They were done on location. So we might think that that brings a certain level of authenticity to the film. And the University of Toronto, I think, just kind of stands in for a lot of the other schools that we see. So think about all of that stuff. Again, clothes matter. Think about Chucky's tracksuits. I think those kind of matter. Clothes, hair, and certainly set design go a long way in creating this sort of realistic portrait of a particular time and place. And I definitely think Van Sant and his writers want to do that. So I just wanted to conclude by talking a little bit more about Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, just because they've been movie stars now for almost 25 years, which is kind of impressive. This movie pretty much made them stars. I mean, you could argue they got even bigger in the years to come as they took on some more high-profile roles. But it's interesting to think that they won the Oscar for screenwriting, right? They won for Best Original Screenplay. They're not always thought of very much as writers. I think we typically identify them more just as actors. And in the case of Matt Damon, that's accurate. Damon primarily is just an actor. He's a producer as well. He's maybe dabbled in a little bit of other writing. If you guys saw a recent film from these two called The Last Duel, not many people watched it. It wasn't a bad film. It was directed by Ridley Scott, I believe, but Affleck and Damon collaborated on the screenplay with Nicole Holofcener. The three of them, she's a pretty well-known writer-director in her own right. The three of them collaborated on the screenplay, but again, that movie didn't find a ton of success. So Damon's primarily known as an actor. He's sometimes thought of as maybe the slightly more successful actor between the two. He's probably become more of a bankable leading man, although that's probably debatable. Affleck was Batman at one point, but he's also been in some bombs. But one interesting thing to observe with Affleck is that he's really sort of transitioned into being more and more of a director. He's really started to carve out a nice career for himself as a director. In fact, he won an Oscar about 10 years ago for Argo, a film he directed. He's done several pretty high-profile movies, Gone Baby Gone, starring Casey Affleck. Some other movies that Affleck also starred in, like The Town, We Live by Night. Not all of those were successful, but some of his have been quite successful, and he's kind of earned a reputation as a very solid sort of, just a good, skilled director. The latest from these two, they keep on collaborating. They're still kind of a package deal for a lot of people, even though they obviously work independently too. But they're in another movie together that just came out called Air. I think it's about Michael Jordan and how Nike developed these shoes, for him back in the 80s and kind of changed the whole sneaker industry. But Damon's the star. Affleck directs and also plays a supporting role as like the founder of Nike. But Matt Damon's the protagonist, just like he is here in Good Will Hunting. So they kind of have a little bit of a formula, right? I think Affleck's generally appreciated a little bit more as a supporting actor, and we're going to see him in another supporting role next week in Shakespeare in Love, which I find to be a really delightful performance from him, probably my favorite work that he's ever done. It's not a really big role, but I find that people kind of like Affleck as the buddy, like he is here, as a supporting player, and Damon is more often maybe the leading man. But they're both very successful, of course, and they've done a lot of different things. Like I said, Damon produces, now Affleck directs, and they've been famous for a long time. Affleck is kind of tabloid fodder at times, I guess. I don't have much to say about his personal life, but like I said, it's interesting that he's moved into a directing career, and of course their origins very much steeped in writing and producing this screenplay, and they're also drawing a little bit on some of their own experiences. I just wanted to mention that. I think I get into it a little bit in the overview, and of course you guys can Google this for more info, but both guys famously are from Boston, or really Cambridge, which is where Harvard is. That's right outside the city. Pretty much the same thing. But Damon even went to Harvard, so he's a little bit more like Skylar and a little bit less like his character, perhaps. His mom was a college professor. It's not like these two guys grew up in the rundown South Boston neighborhood on display in the film, but they are from Boston. And while Damon grew up, pretty affluent, Affleck had a little bit of a different background. He was raised by a single mom, and his dad, it's kind of an interesting figure. Affleck's dad was a failed actor and playwright who was an alcoholic, kind of, abandoned the family at various times. But he also worked a bunch of odd jobs around Boston, and one of them happened to be working as a janitor at Harvard, when I think Affleck was just a kid. So maybe that's probably, at least in part, the inspiration for some of the Will character, working as a janitor. So they were at least familiar with the city. They're familiar with these elite institutions, and they at least know about all of these interesting sort of class divides, these interesting cultural divisions that exist in their home city. So they're definitely exploring that stuff, and they've explored that stuff in some other movies too. They've returned to Boston for some more productions. So we can also share our opinions about them. You guys have probably seen them in some other movies. So if you have opinions about them as actors or as Affleck as a director, you can certainly share that on the discussion board this week. So just a quick reminder that we need to start thinking about our papers pretty soon. I will devote some time at the end of next week's lecture to the final paper assignment. I'll give you a little bit more insight into kind of how I want you guys to approach it, the kind of research that I want you to do. But also, I would like to meet with each of you individually during week 15, our final week of class. We don't have a movie to watch that week. But I would like to meet with each of you individually to talk about your paper ideas. So I'll post a schedule in the week 14 module. We don't have to worry about that yet. So this week, just watch Good Will Hunting, do your post. Next week, I'll have my final lecture. The first half will be about Shakespeare in Love. The second half will be all about the paper. And then I want you guys to kind of get up and running on the paper by next week. And then we can talk about where you are and any questions that you might have in week 15. Okay, so that will be it. So let me know if you have any questions in the meantime. Email me, but we will talk more about those conferences and look for the schedule next week in the week 14 module. And I will see you then for the final lecture of the semester.